Hello, everybody. How we doing? Feeling good? All right. I'm really excited to be here. After doing this work for 18 years, I think spaces like this are so important to re-energize you, right? And to also to be with folks who can hold you accountable, right? To making sure that you're doing your best work all the time. So I really, really appreciate this space and all the creativity, and appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about community. So my job is to instigate some questioning on the theme of community and particularly the role of young people in creating community. So for me, it's like impossible to talk about community and young people's role in community without talking about youth leadership, right? Because of the way I've been trained, because of who has mentored me. I came of age during a time when I feel like we really respected youth leadership or valued youth or expected youth leadership to be in the room. So in learning to organize saved my life. Somebody yesterday was talking about the importance of youth organizing and training young people as organizers. You know, in my generation, we look to the movements that came before us. We looked to the Black Panthers, we looked to SNCC, we looked to the anti-apartheid movement. We knew that we could lead because Fred Hampton, at 21 years old, led. And because we built hip-hop, we created hip-hop and then spread it out to the world, right? So we knew we could lead. And so we built campaigns around the country to shut down prisons, to hold police accountable, to create alternative ways to address harm, to imagine a world beyond prisons, right? And we use culture to do that. So I think part of the reason why we can talk about liberation and juvenile justice in the same breath here in this room is because of years of movement building and cultural production in which we proclaimed that a world without prisons is possible. Am I right? Y'all with me? So the criminalization of young people is not just about bad policy or impoverished communities. It is and has always been about eliminating the threat of youth power, eliminating the threat that young people pose to the established order. And so the work that young people do in community, the work that I'm really interested in is this kind of world building that happens when we use culture to organize. Young people create culture. They create movements, they resist, they use the arts to build movements unlike anyone else. They are cultural organizers, naturally, instinctually, and cultural organizing is about world building. It is taking the material of the present to create the future. And no one does that better than young people. You see it on social media, you see it in neighborhoods, scrawled on walls, you see it even in jails. I mean, when a 16-year-old at Rikers Island can tell me the story of another young man's murder, a man who died a decade before his birth, and offer that story as an origin story to his gang, that's world building, right? And the kinds of communities that we create with them will determine whether they build dystopian worlds of destruction or utopian worlds of love and support. So my question is, how can we support young people to design the communities that will love and support them? But before we complicate and explode that question, I want to offer some reflexive questions for us, right? Because I think we got to sort of till the soil a bit and do some clearing and do some like personal reflection for ourselves. So maybe on another piece of paper, you write these questions down for yourself and do a little bit of reflection here. So the first one is, are the stories we're telling about young people helping or hindering them? Let me say that again. Are the stories we're telling about young people helping or hindering them? Let me tell you why that question is important. So, you know, some of my training is in trauma recovery and body-based approaches to trauma. And so Dr. Bezel van der Kolk is one of the folks who's a leader in this field. And when asked about why there was this huge discrepancy between rates of PTSD in 9/11 survivors versus survivors of Katrina, like 5% versus 33%, he asked us to like look at the sort of the optics, right? Look at how people were treated. So 9/11. People, you see pictures of people crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, going home, going back to their homes. In the media, they're portrayed as heroes, right? Millions of dollars, billions of dollars came in around the world to support survivors of 9/11. How are Katrina survivors treated? Days, weeks, right? Stuck, trapped, trying to survive, stuck in a fight or flight, freeze, right? Betrayed and portrayed as criminals, as refugees, looting, right? The shame of that. Not being displaced from your home, not being able to go home, not being able to go to a safe space, right? So how we treat people when they've experienced trauma decides whether or not that trauma gets frozen in the body and becomes PTSD, right? So what we're talking about is like stories. So are the stories that we tell about young people making them sick? Are we making young people sick with the stories that we tell about them? And are we allowing young people to tell their own stories about who they are? So I, for years, taught drama at El Puente, which is a human rights organization in Brooklyn, and ran a youth theater ensemble there. And my young people devised original theater about issues that were important to them. And one year I had like all young men in my class, and we were having a really tough time figuring out what we were gonna do because, I through all the sort of like idea generation practices I had at them, and nothing really seemed to stick. And I was like, what are we gonna do? We're just not gonna do a show this year? And then one day, one of my students walked in with a newspaper, and on the front of the newspaper, he was really upset, and he walked in and he like threw this newspaper down, and it said 900 new police officers hired in New York City. And everybody was so angry, and I could feel the anxiety in the room just from this headline. And I was like, well, let's talk about that. Why does this cause so much anxiety? And we started talking about like what it means to have new police officers in your neighborhood, right? Cops who don't come from the same neighborhood as you, who don't know your community. And that led to the creation of a play called A Letter to the 900, in which they talked about, here's what you need to know about me and my community before you come here. Right? And they got to tell the story of who they are and demand that people see them as they are and see the assets and the beauty of their community, right? So are we allowing young people to tell their own stories about who they are? So my next question is, do you really trust young people? Do you really trust young people? I mean, come on, let's be honest. We don't really trust young people. That's why we'd invite them today. We don't really trust young people. We don't trust them to lead. So to talk about this, I want to tell my own sort of, like yesterday, we were asked about, our sort of stories around how we got our first jobs. I'm gonna talk about how I came to leadership as a young person. So I grew up in Philly. Where's Philly at? Philly represent, yeah. North Philly, Richard Island Projects. Not here anymore, but yes, Richard Island, 3 generations deep. But so growing up in Philly, it's interesting that I came to doing community work because so much of my childhood was lived in isolation. Because, in my home, there was this lethal mix of domestic violence, addiction, and mental illness. And if I wanted to keep my family together, you can't talk to anybody, right? You can't tell people what's happening in your household if you want to keep those systems out of your house, right? And many young people are doing that work of protecting their families from systems, and it leads to this cycle of despair. Right, and that's what I experienced. So, as a result of this, we moved a lot, and there were definitely periods of homelessness. As a result, I went to, two different elementary schools, 3 different middle schools, and 3 different high schools by the time I graduated. So I didn't have friends or like a real sort of strong connection to a neighborhood, right, or a community of place, which left me really, really isolated. That, by the time I was 12, led to a suicide attempt and self-harm. And I think for me, I realized that I needed to find something, right? I needed to find some place that I could go, right? Some place that I could find that would be a refuge outside of my home. And found a church called Refuge. Found a church in my neighborhood called Refuge. I had a youth program that I became really active in and spent as much time as I could at Refuge, volunteering, helping, just so that I could have a safe place to be. After a year of that, the pastor of my church came to me and said, I'm putting together this leadership circle, and I want to have youth represented on. I want you to represent the youth on this leadership circle. And it was called the Vision Actualization Team. And I remember going to the first meeting, and I was really, really nervous. And I wasn't like a really sort of outgoing kid. I didn't talk a lot. I didn't think anyone cared about what I had to say. And I remember sitting at the table. And I'm sitting there at this table. I was the only young person. It was all men, deacons, church elders, my pastor, only one woman. And he looked at some point in the conversation, he turned to me and he said, "Piper, what do you think?" That question changed my life. That one, what do you think? It's a small thing, but suddenly here I am at this table with these adults, and someone actually cares about what I have to say, right? And being at that table and having people hear me and listen to my ideas made it so that to this day, I will sit at any table. I have no problem sitting at any table. Pisses off, for a long time, pissed men off a lot, the fact that I don't shut up. I feel entitled to speak. And do we create those kinds of opportunities for young people, right? Do we trust them enough to really create the space for them to lead? And what's possible if we trust them? So we're talking about building youth power and youth leadership. So that's bigger than job training. That's bigger than workforce development. That's bigger than offering a stipend or an entry-level job. But it's about creating, helping young people cultivate the set of capacities that will make them unstoppable. Okay? And the last question for you is, are you creating an ecosystem of support? Or are you the only person? You think you're the only person that get it, right? Are you creating an entire ecosystem of support for them? Because support that young people receive shouldn't just come from you. We need to create networks of support that extend well beyond our reach, right? Shit should be happening for them that we don't even see. We don't even feel, So, and then also within that, when is your helping hurting, right? If you have been in a young person's life for 5 years and they haven't moved from the same spot, you have to wonder if maybe you are the thing standing in their way, right? The relationship should be dynamic. They should be growing. They should be evolving. And then eventually they should outgrow you. Suddenly they should become the teacher. You're like, oh shit, I'm gonna sit here and learn from, this person who used to come and sit in front of me and look for me to teach them. Right now, you should be learning from them, right? Do you have those kinds of relationships? But the most important thing that I've learned from young people is that we should just get out of the fucking way and let them lead. Just get out of the way. If you did, things might happen that are so far out of your imagination. There's this great quote from Hemingway where he talks about the fallacy of age, right? That we saw with age comes wisdom. Actually, with age comes caution. Age just makes us more cautious, It's like Tupac said the same thing. You're your most revolutionary when before the age of 30. Because after that, you become more cautious. And so again, the question for this instigation and for this larger exploration is, how can we support young people as they design the communities that will love and support them? And some of that requires us to reflect on how we sustain the systems that exist, how we benefit from those systems, how we work for those systems, right? Whole industries and careers and fields built on those systems. Come on, let's not act like we don't benefit from them, right? We working, right? We build whole careers on it, right? Expertise, thought leadership, right? So what does it mean to put ourselves out of business? Yeah? So ultimately, the last thing I want to say is that none of this matters. None of what I say matters. None of what we talk about here matters until we go back into our communities and into the circles that we sit in with young people and check in with them and see if this even resonates, right? Because anything that we create without them will fall short. Thank you.